Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time to review my first set of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan cards. Now, first things first, please forgive the production qualities on this video. I know that the video here doesn't look too perfect, and I know probably the audio sucks as well. I am recording this from the road, but I wanted to get my Gadgetzan card reviews out as soon as possible, so it was either suffer a drop in production qualities or not produce a video at all. And I chose to take the hit and trap myself in this tiny little box, but review some cards as quickly as possible so you guys can start formulating some thoughts on these cards and get excited about the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan adventure that will be coming out before too long. So today I've gathered 7 new cards that have been revealed. There are many more that were introduced at the first day of BlizzCon, but I can't get to all of them in a single video. So today I've selected Druid cards and a couple Hunter cards as well. So let's jump right in and start discussing these cards. Starting off with the first new one, it's a Druid legendary card called Kun the King. This is a 10 mana 7/7. So, in the vein of like Varian Wrynn, another 10 mana 7/7 class legendary card. And it has a choose one effect, gain 10 armor, or refresh your mana crystals. So, of course, the 10 armor option there is pretty obvious how that works. You just gain 10 health. So, this can be sort of a super defensive late game card that's in essence a heal that's attached to a moderate sized body. Compared to cards like Ancient Shield Bearer and Cthulhu Warrior, this certainly looks a little overcosted for that side of the choose one effect. So I think we have to point it to the other side of the choose one effect to see if this card is designed in a way that elicits some sort of absurd value that you'd expect from a 10 mana legendary minion. And I think maybe it does, right? Because essentially what this means when you say refresh your mana crystals, you play this for 10 mana, and you choose to refresh your mana crystals. Guess what? You've got 10 mana right back. So in essence, this is sort of a 0 mana 7/7 once you reach turn 10. Now that's really good. Obviously, a 4 mana 7/7 is nuts. But the reason the 4 mana 7/7 is so good is because it happens on turn 4. This card is not going to be played on turn 4. Yes, of course, theoretically, you can play it earlier with Druid, things like Wild Growth and Innervate. But even then, very occasionally it might hit on turn 5 or 6. More likely it hits on turn 8, and even more likely it lands on turn 10. And by that point in the game, most people will have found an answer to a 7/7 minion, whether it's spells or a minion of their own, just hard removal they've drawn into. 7/7s aren't that threatening that late in the game. And really, if you think about a card that Druid runs right now with Arcane Giants, this isn't all that different, right? Usually they play a 0 mana 8/8 late in the game, or at least 1 to 2 mana 8/8 sometimes. And essentially, Kun the King would behave very similarly. A 0 mana 7/7, a 0 mana 8/8. It's another sort of tool in that tool book, or that toolkit, I should say. But I don't really think anything about this card's all that spectacular. I may be wrong, I may be crazy, but it just feels mediocre to me. It doesn't feel worth 10 mana. Yeah, there will be those nutty turns where you get Kun the King and like an Ancient of War out, and some other 3 mana card or hero power or whatever, and those will seem insane. But it's going to be a dead card a vast majority of the rest of the time. It's going to force you to build your decks in certain ways. And those kinds of restrictions and the lack of an immediate impact just makes the card feel a little average to me. It's probably playable, particularly just because 10 armor is really good. 10 health like that's just really good sometimes, but I don't think it's exceptional by any means, and not a class-defining card. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one in the list. This one, of course, is another Druid card. This time it's a 5 mana spell called Lunar Visions. And this one allows you to draw 2 cards. And minions that you draw cost 2 mana less. So a 5 mana draw 2 cards is pretty expensive. When you look at other Druid options like Nourish, this is 1 card less for the same mana cost. But of course, I guess the idea with this card is that the penalty you pay in mana cost to cast this spell is made up for the fact that the minions you draw actually cost a little less. So you might pay, say, a 2 mana penalty here compared to something like Arcane Intellect, but you could theoretically gain 4 mana in tempo back by cost reductions in the minions that you draw. Now, of course, the problem is if you draw spells with these 2 cards, you lose all that advantage. And Druid, as we know it right now, is certainly a spell-based class. So there seems to be some sort of counter synergies happening here with the way Druid is played currently. Now, of course, that doesn't mean Druid will always be played that way, but that is what we know now. So that's kind of the assumption I'm operating under. And really, even if you think about just this from a design standpoint, you're playing this on turn 5. Maybe occasionally you're innovating it out on turn 3. You're hoping to get some cost reductions, but those cost reductions won't happen until the mid game, and they're limited to 2 cards in total scope. So a card like Emperor Thorison also reduces costs, but he can reduce the costs of 7 or 8 cards at a time depending upon the size of your hand. And he's attached to a minion, so there's not usually a board penalty when you play him. In other words, he's going to contest stuff that your opponent has out. He's going to eat some removal spells. This card doesn't do that. Its cost reduction is inferior in many, many ways and conditional. And it gives you tempo at a point in the game where tempo is often less valuable. And by that I mean in the mid game. So instead of a card like Innervate, which gives you a cost reduction often very early in the game, so they can have a larger impact faster, this one takes just a little bit longer to have that impact. Not only because it happens on turn 5 or later, but also because you have to play those minions probably on the following turn or ensuing turn, so there's even more delay in the time that you see those cost reductions. So, to me, this doesn't feel like a very strong spell. Now, obviously, who knows? I mean, there's always all kinds of exceptions with Druid spells, and Druid can do crazy things with Innervates and Wild Growths. But at a surface level, I really don't think this one fits or makes a lot of sense to me. I think this is a below average card. So let's move on to the next one. It's another Druid spell. This time it's called Pilfered Power. It's a 3 mana spell. It allows you to gain an empty mana crystal for each friendly minion. Now, I think this is actually kind of potentially nuts, right? So, Wild Growth is one of the defining cards for Druid. It gives you just an empty mana crystal. That's all it does for 2 mana. It gives you an empty mana crystal, right? And that's insanely powerful because it allows you to ramp up your mana faster, play stronger cards faster. Pilfered Power, theoretically, could be like 7 Wild Growths in a single card because you can have up to 7 friendly minions on your side of the board, meaning you could theoretically, right, jump from, say, like 3 mana to 10 mana on the back of a single card. Now, of course, that's super unlikely because you're not going to get 7 minions out by turn 2 or 3. But you very easily could get 2, 3, maybe even 4 minions out by turn 3 with things like Living Roots and all the cheap token minions that Druid has access to. And if your opponent doesn't answer those, then suddenly you could ramp yourself up to 5 or 6 mana by turn 3. It'd be like casting 2 or 3 Wild Growths instantly, which is absolutely ridiculous to me. So in the past, Druid has sort of been torn between really early aggressive decks, things like the Egg Druid and some token style Druids that want to get early minions out. And of course, late game ramp style Druids with big taunts and sort of wall Druids have been called. And of course, right now, something in the middle that's more of a spell synergy Druid, of course. But historically, there's the aggro versus the late game control, and they've never meshed in Druid, right? Like, they don't go together. There's There's aggro pieces and there's ramp / control pieces, and they never fused. But this is a kind of card that actually allows you to fuse those archetypes together a little bit, because you can build a deck that's got a ton of minions and maybe a ton of card draw, or I should say a ton of early game minions and a ton of card draw, that allows you to ramp up pretty quickly and still run big minions successfully and get them out quickly. Now, that said, of course, there's some consistency issues. What happens if you draw your big minions first and you draw your little minions later? This card becomes totally useless. So I don't know that this will ever be sort of the corner piece, the foundation of a deck, but I still think it does give aggressive, um, fast minion-based druids an option, a sort of way to do some really cool stuff, particularly if they want to run big, costly card draw. So, for instance, I could see like a beast Murloc druid, and there's been beast druids and there's been Murloc druids in the distant past, right? But the problem is they innervate out a bunch of Murlocs, or they innervate out a bunch of beasts, and then they run out of cards. And by the time they get to stuff like Nourish, the game is over because they've lost all their minions. It took too long to draw cards, and they suffered a tempo disadvantage. But now, if you play like Living Roots and a couple Enchanted Ravens and a couple Murlocs, you get 4 or 5 minions on the board. You play Pilfered Power. Next turn, you play Nourish with like 3 mana to spare. You draw 3 more minions. You play them out. And then you also run stuff like the Curator to draw even more cards with a costly minion. And suddenly I can start seeing some pieces fitting together, and I can start imagining an aggressive druid deck that actually works and has the late game draw that makes up for unloading your resources in the early game. So I don't know. There's potentially some consistency issues with this card and deck design issues, but it feels like there might be a home for this. And just thinking about the power of the effect, it's pretty insane having that many wild growths built into one thing. So anytime a card is that powerful at a raw level, I definitely don't want to count it out. So let's move on to the next card. This is another Druid spell, as if Druid needed more spells. This is a 1-mana spell, though, Mark of the Lotus. I actually can't believe this is a card. It kind of seems insane. Give your minions +1/+1. A 1-mana spell with this good of a buff. Am I stupid? Is this not just like 1,000 times better than a card like Power of the Wild? It feels very similar. Of course, it doesn't have the flexibility of Power of the Wild, but this is just stupid for a token druid, for an aggressive druid. Any kind of druid, this is so cheap and such an effective buff. It makes sense with the previous card and building a deck around that. You get 4 or 5 minions out. You get a huge, ridiculous buff for 1 mana. It feels to me like this can't be a card. It's so good. I don't see any downsides here. It's an absolutely ridiculous, awesome buff that will encourage a certain style of aggressive play from Druid, but also just fit into token decks. Get those Violet Teachers, get all those little guys out there, get some Wisps out there, and buff them up very cheaply while also enabling and utilizing some of the spell synergies that Druid so loves to see. So yeah, Mark of the Lotus A+. I don't know. It's very good. I don't see any downsides at all. It obviously won't work in some kinds of decks, but the decks that it fits, it feels ridiculously efficient to me. So really, really powerful card. So let's move on to the next one. And this is one of the what are called tri-class cards. So these are like neutral cards that aren't actually neutral. They can be played in 3 specific classes. And Lotus cards can be played in Druid, Rogue, or Shaman. So this is both a Druid card and a Rogue card and a Shaman card. So that's the new thing from Gadgetzan. I don't really know what that looks like or how that operates just yet in the game. But that's what this card is all about. So keep that in mind. I went ahead and slotted it into the Druid card since it is, in fact, potentially a Druid card. So onto the card itself, it's a 5 mana minion. It's a 5/3 in stats. And it has a battle card, discover a Druid, Rogue, or Shaman card. So as far as like stat allocation is concerned, not the best stats ever, right? 3 health minion is often kind of ridiculously easy to deal with. There's so many 3 damage spells, and really cheap minions could kill it. So not a great favorable stat allocation. If it was a 3/5, of course, it'd be considerably stronger on the board itself. So that to me is a pretty big downside right off the bat. As far as the battle cry is concerned, discover effects are great, but discover effects that introduce another layer of randomness. In other words, when you like discover a death rattle card, or you discover a paladin card, there's sort of one layer of randomness. It's you're choosing from a smaller set of random elements. It's just death rattle cards. It's just paladin cards. So it's a little more controlled in its randomness. This, since you're having 3 different options, it's essentially adding that second layer of a random element to it. So it's a Druid or a Rogue or a Shaman card, and then within each of those sets, there's 50 cards each or whatever. So a little extra randomness, of course, that's pretty cool because, Druid could get awesome Shaman cards that otherwise they'd have virtually 0 access to. So I don't know any specific synergies right off the bat, but, even like a Doomhammer would be nuts with a Druid because of the Druid hero power, for instance, right? And there are, I'm sure, 1,000 other synergies I haven't thought of just yet. So there's going to be some cool, fun stuff that happens. It's going to be neat to see. But that said, I don't actually know that this card is good or playable necessarily, just because you're giving up solid body. I feel like you'd rather just run an Azure Drake as a Druid like 99% of the time. So how do you find room for a card like this? Because Azure Drake has better stat allocations, more predictable card draw, and of course spell damage too, which is super important for Druid. So when do you run Lotus Agent for Druid? I just don't know. Maybe it's a Shaman card, maybe it's a Rogue card. I should actually consider it in those contexts now. I think Rogue would still prefer to run Azure Drake, and frankly, Shaman would prefer to run Azure Drake too, with all the spell damage stuff Shaman loves these days. So I don't know why you'd ever run anything over Azure Drake, because it's such a good card, but particularly not Lotus Agents here to me. The Discover is just too unreliable. Now, that said, I guess Rogue actually could use it in sort of a peddler style deck. When you have other class cards and ways to synergize with those, this would enable you to draw the Druid or the Shaman card and do stuff like discount it with Ethereal Peddler and all the other shenanigans Rogue is seemingly going to have access to. So maybe this is designed as sort of a Rogue other class card. That's really the only utility I see for this one personally. So let's move on to my Hunter cards in this review. We've got 2 Hunter cards up for review, the first of which is a new weapon called the Piranha Launcher, and that's a good name and a terrifying idea. And it's a 5 mana weapon. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. It has 4 durability and 2 attack power. And whenever your hero attacks, summon a 1/1 Piranha. So that means you can attack 4 times. And that means you'll get 4 1/1 Piranhas. And you'll get to do 8 damage as well. All for 5 mana. So that's actually a lot of value, right? You get a 4/4 in stats, which isn't like totally absurd for 5 mana right there. I mean, 5 mana summon 4 1/1s would not be good, but it wouldn't be crazy. That's sort of a card right there. Plus, you get a 2/4 weapon. So, that's also worth a few mana. So as far as like a pure efficiency consideration is concerned, you're going to get a lot out of your costs here. Like for 5 mana, you're getting a lot. I think the problem with this card is how long it takes for that value to materialize. So in other words, it takes 4 turns to get your minions out, which, could theoretically have some benefits because it becomes sort of more annoying for your opponents to deal with it, so they can't just play one Ravaging Ghoul to kill every Piranha. It takes time over multiple turns to actually do anything with it. So there's some secondary advantages, but it's also just really slow, and Hunter typically doesn't like to play very slow. They like a little faster speed. Want to get out on the board, so that's a little tough. One thing I like about this is that it's a kind of a guaranteed beast activator. Sometimes it can be hard to get that beast to stick to activate your kill commands or your Houndmasters or whatever else. So this allows you to sort of store one up in that durability and attack, and then finally get your beast, and it's a guaranteed beast. You can sort of save and stock up over time. The 2 attack damage here is certainly not as good as 3 plus, because less things have 2 health than have 3 or more. So that's a little iffy too. I mean, there could be a Hunter deck where this works, but I don't actually see it right now. I think it's a little too slow. So despite all the value packed in, I'm not sure it fits the mentality or playstyle of Hunter well enough to actually be good. So let's move on to the final card for this part 1 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. And this one is the Grimestreet Informant. And this is another of the tri-class cards. This one, though, is a tri-class card that's for Hunter, Paladin, and Warrior, which is a weird assortment. I don't know why Paladin, Warrior, and Hunter got stuck together, but I guess they were the leftovers, maybe. So this is, much like the other ones, maybe the Azure Drake of tri-class cards. This is the Novice Engineer, I guess, of tri-class cards. It's a 2-mana 1/1 that draws you a card. But of course, it's another discover a Hunter, Paladin, or Warrior card to discover a random card from a random class like this. So many of the comments I made for the Lotus Agents card previously apply to this one. It's a little more random. But, I think when you're looking at like the 2-mana draw card slot, that randomness is probably better, because it's giving you like options and giving you some creative outlets, and you're kind of just utilizing your 2-mana turn as a stall or a buy time kind of turn. So it's sort of a free expense often to just lay down a 2-mana card. You're not wasting your whole turn doing it. It's a freebie, so you're kind of seeing what you get, hoping for something cool, looking for a unique interaction with all these different class cards. And, Hunter, Paladin, Warrior is a neat set. Like, Warrior has so many defensive cards, and so does Paladin. And Hunter has some offensive cards, so I like the idea that this is going to probably give you a good chance at getting a weapon, which is great, because Hunters like weapons, and Hunters are good at killing, or weapons are good at killing people too, so that's pretty neat. But it also gives you a chance at defensive cards, which could also be important. So, I don't know that a card like this would be ran in Hunter specifically, just because it's not a beast. It doesn't do anything specific that Hunter likes. But, in Paladin or Warrior, maybe it would be ran, just from time to time in certain kinds of decks. Particularly like Reno-style decks that don't allow duplicates. Maybe this is just another way to draw an extra card. Plus, of course, anytime you can draw a Paladin card, I guess there's a chance you get Tyrion Fordring, and Tyrion Fordring's so good that alone might make a card like this worth considering, just for that 1 in 50 times you get Tyrion. Who knows? So, again, probably not an amazing card. I don't think it's going to define any decks. I really don't even think it's going to be played much, but it's okay enough that it certainly could be. So who knows what we'll see from the Grimestreet Informant. And that's going to do it. That's all of the 7 cards I prepared for this review. So I'm losing my voice. It couldn't come any faster. So thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for checking out these new cards. I will be doing more reviews as quickly as possible to move through all 132 new cards from the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. As far as this set is concerned, I really didn't see any standouts or amazing cards. I guess actually the buff card was pretty good. Mark of the Lotus seems pretty strong, but everything else is like average to potentially good, depending upon a lot of variables. Who knows? But overall, not the strongest set of cards I've ever seen, I would say. So again, that'll do it for me. If you have any thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear them. So feel free to leave a comment below with your take on these cards, anything I missed. If you disagree, I'd love to hear those thoughts as well. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.